In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved a cradle of civilization, there rose a kingdom built not on mercy, but on mastery of terror. The Assyrian Empire, vast and unyielding, was ruled by kings who believed that fear was stronger than faith. Among them stood one name that made enemies tremble long before his armies arrived: Tiglath-Pileser III. He was no ordinary ruler. He ascended the throne in 745 BCE, when chaos gnawed at the edges of the empire, and rebellion flickered in every corner. He crushed it not with promises, but with punishment. Tiglath-Pileser understood that loyalty born of fear lasted longer than loyalty born of love. His court chroniclers etched his deeds in cuneiform tablets, describing him as the mighty king, king of all peoples, king of the 4 quarters of the world. Unlike the kings before him, Tiglath-Pileser reorganized everything, the army, the provinces, even the gods' temples, to serve one purpose: domination. His soldiers were not mere warriors. They were instruments of divine terror, marching in disciplined rows beneath banners soaked in the blood of his enemies. Every campaign he waged became a ritual of control, and every conquest a sermon in brutality. He ruled from the city of Kalhu, now known as Nimrud, a place that glimmered with gold but reeked of death. Beneath its ziggurats, artisans carved reliefs of kings trampling foes underfoot, and priests chanted blessings over weapons meant to tear flesh. The empire's strength was built on spectacle, a theater of violence performed for the gods and the people alike. Tiglath-Pileser saw rebellion not as a threat, but as an opportunity, a stage on which he could remind the world of Assyria's supremacy. When distant cities whispered of defiance, he marched without delay, bringing with him scribes to record every slaughter, every conquest, every pile of corpses. For him, history itself was a weapon. He believed that the gods of Assyria, Ashur, Ishtar, and Adad, demanded not peace but proof of devotion through war. The sacrifices he offered were not of animals or gold, but of men. He declared that every victory was a sacred duty, every execution an act of worship. To defy the king was to defy the gods. The Assyrian royal ideology painted Tiglath-Pileser as chosen by Ashur himself, a man whose sword carried divine judgment. When his army set out, priests walked before them, burning incense and chanting to the heavens. Behind them followed chariots, siege towers, and soldiers armed with spears that glinted under the Mesopotamian sun. They moved like a living storm, and wherever they passed, cities were erased. Yet it was not enough to win. Tiglath-Pileser wanted memory, to carve fear into the minds of generations. He knew that physical death was temporary, but terror could live forever in the stories of survivors. He turned war into a ritual, conquest into ceremony. His empire became a living shrine to brutality. Inside his palace, walls were adorned with carved scenes of his triumphs. Prisoners kneeling, chains around their necks, enemies flayed and impaled. These images were not decoration. They were declarations. Any envoy who entered the throne room understood what awaited those who disobeyed. The walls themselves whispered warnings. Tiglath-Pileser spoke often of Ashur's favor. He believed his victories were divine approval of his cruelty. His inscriptions boasted not of mercy, but of punishment. "I swept away their lands like a flood," he wrote. "I heaped up their corpses, I cut off their heads." These were not exaggerations, they were records, grim and deliberate, meant to be read by kings and rebels alike. In his court, generals were rewarded for creative cruelty. Those who brought the heads of enemy leaders were paraded through the capital in processions that mixed triumph with horror. Everyone watched as prisoners were marched to their deaths, learning early that to serve Assyria was to serve power without pity. He built temples not only to honor gods, but to remind his people who held divine favor. Each temple courtyard bore trophies of war, shields, weapons, and sometimes more dreadful offerings. The god Ashur's altars stood before a spectacle of punishment. Those who entered to pray did so surrounded by silent witnesses of Tiglath-Pileser's wrath. His spies traveled across the empire, carrying reports of whispers and unrest. A single murmur of rebellion was enough to summon the king's rage. He struck swiftly, believing that mercy was weakness and delay was sin. In his mind, fear was the truest form of loyalty. Even neighboring kingdoms trembled at his name. Tribes of Aram, Judah, and Israel paid tribute to avoid his wrath. His emissaries demanded gold, silver, and soldiers, and when denied, his chariots answered. His reputation traveled faster than his armies, hollowing courage before battle even began. Tiglath-Pileser saw the world as a vast stage where only the strongest could command survival. His wars were not just campaigns, they were messages. Each conquered city became a verse in a hymn of horror sung in Ashur's name. The Assyrian Empire, under his rule, was not merely political, it was psychological. In the eyes of his people, he was divine justice. In the eyes of his enemies, he was the storm that blotted out the sun. His court scribes immortalized his words, his image, his victories, but none captured the dread he inspired simply by existing. His reign transformed Assyria into the most feared force in the ancient world. Soldiers became priests of death, kings became living gods, and fear became law. He built monuments to power, not peace, believing that a king's immortality depended not on how long he lived, but how deeply he was feared. And as his empire grew, so did the rituals that sustained it. Temples grew darker, altars more demanding, and ceremonies more grotesque. The offerings to the gods became bloodier with every victory, each campaign feeding a cycle of terror that bound king, people, and deity together in a covenant of cruelty. By the time Tiglath-Pileser reached the height of his reign, Assyria was no longer a kingdom of men. It had become a machine of fear, every soldier a blade, every priest a witness, every city a warning. And soon that machine would birth its most infamous ritual, the Pit of Heads, a spectacle of divine vengeance where the line between faith and horror vanished beneath the shadow of Ashur. Quick reminder, please subscribe the channel for more upcoming content. Let's continue the video. The Pit of Heads was not born from madness alone, it was born from design. Tiglath-Pileser III understood that victory was not complete until it echoed through the hearts of those yet unconquered. And so deep within the sacred city of Kalhu, beneath the shadow of Ashur's towering temple, he conceived a ritual that would turn death itself into divine spectacle. It began after one of his greatest campaigns, the siege of Arpad. The city had defied him for 3 long years, its walls thick with arrogance and its people blind with pride. When it finally fell, Tiglath-Pileser ordered not just the slaughter of its soldiers, but the erasure of its very name. Yet he sought more than destruction, he sought remembrance. At his command, the soldiers gathered every severed head from the battlefield. The order was clear. None were to be left behind. The heads of warriors, rebels, and even city elders were brought forth in carts. Thousands of them. The smell of blood and dust hung heavy over the city like a funeral shroud. They dug a massive pit before the temple of Ashur, wide enough to swallow an army. The king stood upon a stone platform overlooking the excavation, surrounded by priests draped in crimson robes. To the people, it was a holy act. To Tiglath-Pileser, it was a message carved into eternity. The ritual began at sunset. Drums thundered through the air as soldiers marched in single file, tossing the heads of their slain enemies into the pit. Each thud echoed like a heartbeat of vengeance. The priests chanted hymns to Ashur, calling upon the god of war to accept the offering. Flames from torches flickered against the ziggurat walls, turning the faces of the dead into a grotesque sea of shadows. The king raised his arm, his voice booming over the chants. "Ashur, Lord of the Storm, behold your feast. These are the defiant, crushed beneath your power. Let their souls tremble in your presence." The crowd erupted in cheers, but behind those voices was a deeper silence, the silence of fear. For the Assyrians, this was no mere display. It was faith made flesh. The Pit of Heads symbolized purification, rebellion fed to the gods so the empire could remain clean. Parents brought their children to witness it, believing that seeing the king's wrath was witnessing divine justice. The smell of decay became the perfume of loyalty. The ritual evolved into a terrifying routine. After every major conquest, a new pit was dug before the temples of Ashur, Ishtar, or Ninurta. The heads of enemies were piled high, sometimes arranged in symmetrical towers that reached the king's waist. Soldiers were ordered to wash their weapons in the blood that pooled below, an act said to cleanse them before the next campaign. The priests claimed that the heads spoke to the gods through their silence. They believed Ashur's strength flowed through the skulls of the defeated, fueling Assyria's victories. In truth, Tiglath-Pileser understood something far more human, that terror binds stronger than devotion. Every pit was a monument to control, not worship. Foreign emissaries, summoned to Kalhu, were forced to walk past these pits before entering the palace. Some fainted, others vomited. Tiglath-Pileser would watch them closely, noting which men flinched. He believed fear was the truest test of loyalty. The ritual had become his psychological weapon, one that conquered hearts without a single sword. Scribes recorded each offering meticulously. On clay tablets, they described how many heads were taken, from which lands, and whose names adorned the piles. The pit of heads became both history and warning, an archive of terror for future generations to obey. When rebellion broke out in Babylon, Tiglath-Pileser sent messages to its leaders bearing only 3 words: "Remember the pit." The words alone were enough to dissolve resistance. The pit had become legend, its horror traveling faster than his armies. Entire cities surrendered at the sound of his name, hoping to avoid becoming sacrifices to Ashur's hunger. One inscription found centuries later described a ceremony in which Tiglath-Pileser himself anointed the pit with oil and wine, not as a king, but as a priest. He believed himself the mediator between gods and men, channeling the fury of heaven through acts of blood. To him, the pit was holy ground. It was said that after each ceremony, he would descend alone into the temple's inner sanctum. There, before the golden idol of Ashur, he would kneel and whisper prayers of gratitude for the terror he had unleashed. The line between faith and madness blurred, until even his closest advisors feared him more than they revered him. The priests, too, grew drunk on their power. They began to interpret every omen through the language of violence. A storm meant the gods were pleased. A drought meant the empire had not bled enough. Soon the pit of heads was no longer reserved for foreign enemies. It was used against traitors within. Governors, generals, and even royal cousins vanished, their heads appearing among the offerings days later. In one infamous ceremony, Tiglath-Pileser ordered the execution of a noble accused of plotting against him. The man's head was severed and presented before the king as he dined. Without flinching, he motioned for it to be added to the pit. That night, the drums thundered again, echoing through Kalhu like the heartbeat of a vengeful god. Foreign envoys returned home with tales of this pit, of the endless mounds of skulls gleaming in the torchlight, of priests dancing barefoot through blood, and of a king whose face never softened. These stories spread across empires, growing darker with each retelling. By then, Tiglath-Pileser didn't need to conquer. His reputation did it for him. The pit became more than ritual. It became a symbol of Assyrian identity. To live under Ashur's empire was to live beneath the gaze of those hollow eyes. The skulls, preserved and stacked, were reminders that disobedience was eternal death, both body and memory devoured by divine wrath. But beneath the surface of this perfect order, whispers grew. Some priests began to question whether Ashur truly demanded so much blood. The air in Kalhu grew heavy with the stench of decay, and even the winds seemed cursed. The people bowed lower than ever before, but their prayers grew quieter. Tiglath-Pileser did not notice the change. Power had become his god, and terror his scripture. As the years passed, the pit before Ashur's temple deepened, so deep that no one could see the bottom. Some said it reached the underworld itself, where the souls of the condemned begged for release. Each sunrise, vultures circled over the city, feasting upon what the priests left behind. The temple bells tolled not for peace, but for punishment. And still, the king smiled. For in his mind, fear was order and silence was faith, silence. But even gods grow weary of too much blood. And soon, whispers of divine discontent would rise, not from his enemies, but from within the empire itself. The same terror that had built his throne would begin to shake its foundation. As the years passed, the pit of heads no longer inspired awe. It inspired dread, even among the faithful. The ritual that once symbolized divine order had turned into a haunting presence that refused to fade. The air around Ashur's temple hung heavy with decay. The once golden ziggurat now stood beneath a permanent cloud of vultures, circling like spirits bound to the blood below. Tiglath-Pileser III had grown older, but not gentler. His eyes, once sharp with ambition, had become hollow mirrors of the terror he had created. He still ruled from Kalhu, issuing decrees with iron certainty, but the fire that once burned in his name began to wane. Beneath his power, cracks were forming, unseen but inevitable. It began with the priests. Some whispered that Ashur had turned his face away. The sacred flames in the temple's altar, once fierce and eternal, began to flicker unpredictably. Offerings burned to ash too quickly. The omens turned dark. Eclipses, droughts, strange cries in the night. To many, these were signs that the gods had grown weary of human blood. But Tiglath-Pileser would not hear it. He ordered more sacrifices, greater pits, deeper prayers. He believed the gods demanded more devotion, more terror. The priests obeyed in silence, but fear no longer felt like faith. Beneath their chants, there was exhaustion, sorrow, and guilt. The ritual that once unified the empire now divided it. The pit before Ashur's temple had become a wound in the earth. Rainwater mixed with blood to form a dark, stagnant pool that never seemed to dry. Even the strongest soldiers refused to guard it at night. They claimed to hear voices, whispers rising from the pit, the faint murmur of thousands of severed tongues. Some said the heads still moved, their mouths forming curses against the king who had condemned them. Soon, strange things began to happen in Kalhu. Livestock died without reason. Crops failed near the riverbanks. Children were born with birthmarks shaped like screaming faces. The people began to fear not the king's wrath, but the pit's curse. They called it Ashur's shadow, the dark reflection of the god's anger. The palace scribes stopped recording the pit ceremonies. Tablets went unwritten or deliberately broken. The chroniclers who once glorified Tiglath-Pileser's victories now avoided his gaze. In their hearts, they knew what he could not accept. The king had gone too far. Even his generals began to withdraw their loyalty. They had fought in his name, carved his empire across nations, but now they muttered that the gods had abandoned Assyria. The soldiers who once marched proudly beneath the banner of Ashur now dreaded each new campaign, knowing the price their victories demanded. One night during a storm, lightning struck the ziggurat's peak. Fire raced down its side, and the wind carried the smell of burning flesh from the pit below. The priests rushed to extinguish the flames, but when the storm cleared, the top of the temple, where Ashur's golden idol had once stood, was gone. Some said the god had fled. Others whispered he had been devoured by the very offerings meant for him. The king refused to see it as a sign. Instead, he doubled the sacrifices. Thousands of prisoners were brought from conquered lands and executed before dawn. The pit overflowed again, spilling its contents into the streets. The people wept as their city turned into a grave. But the curse could not be contained. Illness began to spread, a fever that spared neither soldier nor priest. Bodies piled faster than they could be buried. The same drums that once thundered in victory now beat in mourning. The empire that had ruled by terror was now ruled by disease and despair. Tiglath-Pileser's closest advisors begged him to end the rituals, to seal the pit and cleanse the temple. But he refused, calling them heretics and cowards. "Fear built this empire," he roared, "and fear shall keep it." Yet his voice trembled, as if even he could feel the god's silence pressing against him. One evening, the high priest, an old man who had served since the king's first campaign, approached him alone. "My lord," he whispered, "the pit no longer feeds the gods. It feeds itself." But Tiglath-Pileser struck him down where he stood, his blade flashing through candlelight. The next morning, the priest's head joined the others in the pit, his eyes staring up at the sky that no longer listened. That night, the king dreamed of the dead. He saw the pit rising from the earth, stretching into the heavens like a black tower. Faces of his victims screamed from its sides, calling his name. He woke drenched in sweat, the echo of their cries still ringing in his ears. Outside, the city was silent, or too silent. Even the wind had stopped. The next morning, the guards found him sitting alone in his throne room, his crown cast aside. He was muttering to himself, speaking to unseen figures. Before him lay a small clay bowl filled with dark water, a mirror of the pit itself. When they tried to speak to him, he raised a trembling hand and whispered, "Ashur is hungry still." No one knows how Tiglath-Pileser III died. Some claimed he was poisoned by his own priests. Others said he descended into the pit himself during a final ritual and never returned. When his son took the throne, he ordered the pit sealed with stone and the temple rebuilt. But the ground beneath Kalhu was never clean again. Travelers who came to the city decades later wrote of strange sounds beneath the earth, of faint moans rising through cracks in the stone. The wind carried whispers in dead tongues. No birds nested near the temple ruins, and no flowers grew there. The people avoided the site altogether, calling it the mouth of Ashur. The empire that Tiglath-Pileser forged through terror continued for a time, conquering lands and collecting tribute. But the soul of Assyria had changed. Its people obeyed, not out of faith or fear, but emptiness. The rituals had drained them, leaving only shadows of loyalty where once there had been fire. And when Assyria finally fell centuries later, when Babylon and Persia rose to erase its memory, they found no defenders among the people of Kalhu. The terror that once united the empire had long since devoured it from within. All that remained of Tiglath-Pileser's legacy was the whisper of his pit, a dark reminder that even kings cannot feed gods with blood forever. The pit of heads, once a symbol of divine power, had become the grave of Assyria's soul. Beneath the sands of northern Iraq, archaeologists still find fragments, skulls fused with soil, altars stained with time. But the true relic of Tiglath-Pileser's reign is not in stone or bone. It lingers in the ancient fear that once ruled empires, the belief that terror could be eternal. And perhaps in some quiet way it is. For even now, when the desert wind sweeps over the ruins of Kalhu, locals say it carries a whisper, faint but unending, the voice of a king who mistook fear for glory, calling out from the depths of the earth, "Ashur is hungry still."